start looking at megaliths and all kinds of things. And I'll be talking, just like Graham and Samir, I'll be talking a lot about mainstream archaeology and versus what we're seeing and what they say and what some of the evidence is. So Graham was showing this too. Mainstream archaeologists for a long time were saying that the oldest ruins in the world, although a lot of people didn't know this, were in Malta. And some of the ruins of Malta and Gozo, even by mainstream archaeologists, went back to 5000 BC, 6, even 7000 BC. There was a story on Gozo that I was told that a German university had done excavations there at the Gigantija ruins, which are these right here. And there's, by the way, all these cart tracks and stuff in Malta. But they found like 30 headless skeletons, and when they tried to carbon date them, they could find no carbon-14 in them. And that meant that they were over 30,000 years old. Whoa. And when a university, makes a discovery like that, they can't believe it, so they don't publish it. And, one of the things at Malta, too, that Malta's evidence that the Mediterranean, back before the last ice age, was actually not a sea. It was a dry area with a bunch of lakes. All these Mediterranean islands, like Malta, were not islands at the time. In fact, there were pygmy elephants and pygmy rhinos and stuff living there. But then a giant tidal wave washed into the Mediterranean, wiped all this out, killed all those animals, and then washed them into this cave in Malta. It's called the Dargalam Cave. And that's where they would find all the remains of these pygmy elephants and pygmy rhinos and things like that. Mainstream archaeologists are saying, as Graham had said just a little while earlier, is a place in south-central Turkey, near to the Syrian border, called Göbekli Tepe. And those ruins are now supposedly the oldest ruins in the world, according to mainstream archaeology. And they're going back to around 9,000, 10,000 BC. And that is the time of Atlantis, as Plato and the Egyptians told them. Göbekli Tepe is a megalithic site, and it was buried on this hill. And what's strange about Göbekli Tepe is that, and here's the Göbekli Tepe area, and in fact it's right near where a lot of the fighting is right today, is that the mainstream archaeologists who are actually from a German university, and they are Catholics, and they're saying that Göbekli Tepe was built before civilization, that there wasn't civilization, there weren't cities, there weren't stonemasons, but yet, they just put this thing together. And of course that doesn't make any sense. There had to be some kind of civilization before this, people who are organized, who are stonemasons, who are going to erect giant megalithic monuments. And that's what we're going to see around the world right now. The largest known megaliths in the world, at least those that are above water, are the ones at Baalbek in Lebanon. And this is also a dangerous area to go to. It's difficult to go to many areas today. But here at Baalbek are massive ashlars weighing up to 1,000 tons. The largest one is still partly in the quarry and buried. It weighs over 1,000 tons. And in fact, the whole idea of any modern construction company today moving these stones and stacking them up is out of the question. They can't do it. But modern archaeologists have to explain how giant megalithic blocks, this is the size of a railway car or something, are moved. And here's how they've explained it. There are these small little cuts, like hourglass cuts, are made into the blocks for like a V-shaped wedge to fit in. A cage is built around the block, what you're seeing down over here, and all these ropes and pulleys are put around it, and then they move this block a few inches, and then do it all over again. And you have to ask yourself, with all this kind of thing, is why would anyone even try and do this? Why are people trying to do things so incredibly different. This is what the Mediterranean would look like without the water. We were talking about Malta and stuff. The whole Middle East and everything would have changed, much like Graham was saying earlier. When you talk also about pre-Egyptian ruins in Egypt, you have this place which is known as the Osirion in Abydos. The Osirion is actually below the surface of the ground. Another Egyptian temple is built there because of these other ancient ruins. And there at the Osirion, it's down in the swamp. The Egyptian government spent years, decades, trying to pump out the Osirion. And what I wanted to also make you notice is some of these little knobs and stuff here, and also the way the oddball little angles that you're seeing on some of the blocks, the way they're notched and fitted together. And we're going to be seeing a lot of this all over the world. So we'll start moving around. This is a famous part of a wall in Cuzco. The whole idea of these granite megalithic blocks being fitted together in a jigsaw pattern and locked in without any kind of mortar. This is the famous stone of 12 angles in Cuzco. Those who've been to Cuzco have seen it, where you're going to have the blocks all locked in. And part of the idea of this is that what happens is when a big shockwave of an earthquake hits these walls, like these in Cuzco, they move with the shockwave, and the whole wall is able to move in the stones, but they're locked in together because of this jigsaw patterns. So once the shockwave of the earthquake has passed through, they fall back into place. The opposite kind of construction of this would be just simple brick construction with layers, and then the bricks can shear, and any kind of brick building particularly is going to be totally demolished in any kind of an earthquake. This now, it looks very similar to walls that you see around Cuzco and stuff like that, but it's actually the Necromanticon, which is an underground, also ruins, only discovered in the 1960s in northern Greece. And it's up near the Albanian border. Once again, you see these jigsaw patterns. They had to dig this all out. The blocks are locked into place. And in fact, the ancient Greeks, they associated these ruins, supposedly, with the river Styx and the underworld and Hades and things like that. All right, we're back up into the high Andes around Cuzco, where we see more of this kind of gigantic blocks of stone. And in this case, they're mainly limestone, put together in what's called the Sacsayhuaman Fortress, which is above Cuzco. Gigantic megalithic fortress. Here it is seen by the air. You see how this whole zigzag patterns, and there were a bunch of towers up at the very top up here. And those towers are destroyed. There's other towers around Lake Titicaca. They're known to be pre-Inca, although mainstream archaeologists are saying that the Incas built all this. These are some of the giant blocks at Sacsayhuaman. According to mainstream archaeologists, the Incas were building this only about 150 years before the Spanish got there, if you can believe that. Moving these gigantic blocks of stone, weighing hundreds of tons in many cases. And one of the things you also see around Cuzco and Sacsayhuaman are these bizarre boulders that are all carved, but they're upside down, they've fallen apart. Some kind of stonemason has come in here, he's cutting very sharp edges and things like this, but for what would seem no reason at all. And in fact, again, the mainstream archaeologists are totally baffled. Their explanation is, oh, well, the Inca stonemasons wanted to practice. So they came up here and, cut these things into these upside down boulders. What for? One of the other things that you see around Cuzco and Sacsayhuaman, and there's many, many stories, are tunnels. And some of them are totally rock cut through solid rock. And there are places around Sacsayhuaman where you can still go into parts of these tunnels. The Peruvian government actually blocked most of them off. There are stories that the sun disk and 13 gold-clad mummies of the previous Inca emperors were put into this tunnel system at the time of the conquest to keep it from the Spanish. So there's lots and lots of strange things. Mainstream archaeologists are again saying that, okay, these are people with no knowledge of the wheel or writing. They didn't have pulleys. Everything had to be just brute strength. They're going to use lots of ropes. And in fact, what a stonemason, he's a Swiss-American, and I discuss him at great length in my book, my new book on ancient technology in Peru and Bolivia, is that he would say, well, you get so many, literally thousands of people, and it was not a dozen people like this, but he had to calculate that it would take like 2,000 people dragging on these blocks, up these ramps and things like that to get them up into place. And that all works, you know, you can mathematically figure it, but the problems he couldn't figure out were at certain places where they're trying to supposedly drag these blocks up, he couldn't figure out where all those people would stand. 2,000 of them. And so, yeah, everything made sense until it was like, well, I can't figure out where these 2,000 people are all going to be standing while they pull on these ropes, but, you know, that's how they had to do it. So once again, you have the mainstream archaeologists, they're trying to explain things within the context of, well, the mainstream archaeology that they've learned. Machu Picchu, the famous megalithic city in the Andes. It is a megalithic city. It's a secret city. It's built up on top of a mountain. It's got giant megalithic blocks in it. Mainstream archaeologists say it was also built 150 years before the Spanish got there by the Inca Emperor Pachacuti. And yet some people think that the Incas hardly even knew about this city themselves. But they may well have lived there. But you see, again, all this perfect fitting of these blocks, also large lichen patches. Machu Picchu, like most of the things in the Andes, must be many, many thousands of years old. Here we go, near to Machu Picchu, along the Urubamba River, is another very strange megalithic site known as Ollantaytambo. And when you're at Ollantaytambo, you'll first start walking up these stairs, up these terraces, and then you get up to what's called the Sun Temple up here. It's on the edge of this cliff. And as you are going up the stairs, you'll then start to see these giant blocks, also jigsaw patterns, large lichen spots. And again, notice these little knobs coming out. They can't figure out what those are for. And we saw those also at the Osirion in Egypt as well. One interesting idea of these knobs, mainstream archaeologists would say, well, those knobs were somehow for poles and braces, beams to sort of hold up the walls while they're perfectly chipping away patiently, because these walls are perfectly fitted. Every little corner. It's quite amazing. So here, once again, we're seeing these little jigsaw. They're perfectly fitted. You can't really get a knife blade in between these blocks. And once again, the large lichen patches really are indicative of great age on a rock. As you get up to the top, towards Ollantaytambo, you start seeing some really strange things. Huge blocks of stone like this, just lying there. They've been squared. They're heavily articulated. They're massive blocks of red granite, and they're just sitting there. I mean, they apparently were to be part of some structure, but they're just sitting there like this. And then you see things like this, where a giant block is here, and it's notched and everything there. And but then what's in there is this like kind of crummy rubble. So you have two different phases of construction, as I'm talking over here, and you have notched stones. And mainstream archaeologists are saying, okay, well, that's just how the Incas built stuff. You know, they would have some 20-ton, 100-ton, perfectly, squared block of granite. And then, well, they try to get it in place, and then they would just fill the wall up with some crummy rubble, kind of like that. You're thinking, no, this really can't be. When you get up there with the Sun Temple, you will see, this is the main thing that people see, is this big wall of 7 giant megaliths of granite with these very thin sheets of granite between them. Also, you see all the knobs. There's an Andean cross. This was, again, one of the walls I was trying to show, I was showing you earlier, where they're saying this is Inca construction. All right, you've got here your 100-ton granite block, and then once again, you're notching it over here. Clearly, some other 50-ton, 100-ton block is to be notched and fitted into it, but it's not. And rather, again, it's this crummy rubble. It's just filled it in. And so in a sense, what we're saying is these giant megalithic blocks, that's Atlantean construction, if we want to call it that, while these small little bits of rubble, you know, that's Inca construction right there. But the mainstream archaeologists, they're not ready quite to recognize that yet. So again, this is the kind of thing you see, just it's as if this place was destroyed, hit by some massive cruise missile, some cataclysm, destroyed. And in fact, what the mainstream archaeologists say here is that, well, the Incas just didn't ever quite complete the whole thing. Now, one of the questions, too, is how they're going to move these blocks, move them around, and that's another whole question. But you see here again, this special articulation, these edges, very sharp edges, very smooth. This is the kind of construction and cutting of a block that has to be done with power tools. So rather than people just bashing rocks out, megaliths out with basically a rock, a ball hammer in your hand, I mean, this is how they say the Egyptians and the Peruvians and stuff all made these things. What you need, in fact, are giant saws, power tools, diamond tip tools, things like that. Even I would say things like laser cutters and things like that. One of the other strange things that you see at Ollantaytambo are blocks that have keystone cuts. And we're going to be seeing a bunch of these around the world in a little bit. So this is what's called a keystone cut. A keystone cut is often either an hourglass type shape or a T shape. Sometimes they're circular. And they're cut into two blocks. You can't really have a keystone cut on just one block. It has to be spanning two blocks. And you would think that giant blocks like this anyway, that are weighing 100 tons or something, and they're all perfectly fitted together, you wouldn't think these are going anywhere, for that matter. But then they start putting these keystone cuts on it. Now, these keystone cuts themselves are really a clear indication that the Incas didn't build these structures, and in fact that they're much older. And once we'll be going to Tiwanaku and Pumapunku here in a minute, and we'll be seeing more of these keystone cuts. This is also at Ollantaytambo, and here's a keystone cut, but it's on a megalithic block that's sideways. And these keystone cuts can't be like this. I mean, this is a block of stone that's not where it's supposed to be. The keystone cuts have to be poured, and metal clamps are then poured into these the keystone cuts, and then to make what's a metal cramp or a clamp, as they say. But it has to be on a horizontal face, because that liquid metal has to be poured into it. So it can't be here where this is. And we're going to see more stuff like this too. Strange places where the keystone cuts and the blocks are just not where they could possibly be, or what the original builders would have intended anyway. These giant megalithic blocks have to come from some site, and they do. They come from a quarry called that's above Ollantaytambo. I've been up there a couple of times. It's a whole day of riding horses and hiking. You go up to a mountain. As you look back at Ollantaytambo, you see some interesting thing. You see this pyramid that's built into the fields. And it's a kind of a simulacra, almost like an illusion or something. Because you're looking back, what you're really just seeing is like potato and cornfields or something, but they're built in such a way that what you're seeing is a pyramid. And this is up on the way towards the quarry. Once you get higher up into the mountains, this is the quarry for Ollantaytambo, where these gigantic blocks of red granite are coming from. And it's a huge cliff area with all of this granite rubble. And it's as if someone blasted out this cliff, again, with some kind of weapons or missiles or something. And what came down then were giant blocks of granite. And then once you get up there, they would take these giant blocks of granite, they would cut them, apparently with a gigantic circular saw. I mean, literally slicing bread, only they're doing it with granite. And in fact, one of the blocks there, as you can see, they started to slice it with this giant saw. I mean, and what I'm talking about here is power tools. And power tools need electricity to power them. They have to be massively huge wheels, diamond saws, as you would say. And then they start slicing and squaring these blocks of stone. And that's just part of it, because after they slice these stones into gigantic railway-sized blocks of stone or something, then they got to move them down the mountain. They got to move them across a river and then up onto this other ridge. And the archaeologists have to figure it out. And this is where they start all running into trouble. One of the other things that's up there at this quarry is this weird wheel. And it's like some Fred Flintstone wheel, you know, for his car or something. And it's also perfectly smooth. And this thing too has just been sliced with a giant saw. It's perfectly smooth. While mainstream archaeologists would say, oh, well, the Incas had to go up there with a rock in their hand, bash this thing out till it was perfectly round and smooth, and then they just decided to leave it there. So some of the interesting things. All right, let's go back to Cuzco. The center, most important building in Cuzco is called the Sun Temple, the Coricancha. The Spanish turned it into a monastery, and it was destroyed in a number of earthquakes, and it was rebuilt after an earthquake in 1948, and that's when they started reconstructing it. In the Sun Temple of Cuzco was this sort of a reproduction, but there was a gold sun disk. There were 13 gold-clad emperors. The previous Inca mummies were kept there. There was a tunnel system, too, supposedly, that went from the Sun Temple underground to the Sacsayhuaman Fortress, which was up on a hill. It's about a mile away or so. And stories are too that this great treasure that was kept in the Sun Temple, which had like walls of, you know, sheets of gold on the walls and everything, that a lot of that, the treasure was actually put into this tunnel system underground, and a lot of it's still there. One of the other legends in Peru is that this fantastic gold treasure, I mean, this is El Dorado, was actually then sent to another secret city that's never been found, called Paititi. And Paititi is supposed to be like a Machu Picchu city high up in the mountains, but it's a secret city, and it's still lost today. I mean, it's just, in a sense, a legend. When you're in the Coricancha too, there's a couple of unusual doors with all this articulation and drill holes. It's all done in very hard granite. It's megalithic. Once again, the perfectly fitted blocks of stone are there. But it's as if some kind of machinery or something was placed into this alcove. And it was held there. It would have been some kind of iron, steel, some hard metal, some machine. Perhaps, if we wanted to get really high-tech here, a time travel device, a Stargate, some communication device or something like that. And as I'm going to keep maintaining, you know, throughout this whole presentation, these guys have electricity, they have power tools, they've got laser cutters, they've got all this stuff, and that's what they need. And speaking of stargates and stuff, as you go along the Lake Titicaca, the western shore, you do come to this famous place known as the Stargate. Here it is. It's cut into this solid rock that's like a ridge coming down. You can see it from the main road as you're going by, but many tourists missed it for decades. But in the last 10, 15 years or so, it has become something of a tourist spot. And there's this small little village there that desperately could use some tourist money, and they're getting it now. People call this door, they call it the Devil's Door, the Gate of Amaru, Muru. Strange things are said to happen here. People are said to walk into this door or come out of it. Perhaps it is some kind of stargate or something like that. We don't really know. Here we go. It's pretty high. This thing right here, the main part, it's about 6 feet high, and then this thing comes up. But it's been, it's also been cut, apparently by power tools and stuff like that. And it's been sitting there a long time. It's possible that other walls and structures were built up against it, and then they're gone today. By the way, the Egyptians did this too. They would create these, what we call false doors. Just doors cut into solid rock and walls, but they don't really go anywhere. And this one is in Giza, in fact, right here. So it's also a similar type door. Down in the eastern jungles of Bolivia, as you start to go into the jungle, is this other very strange archaeological site known as Samaipata. And it's on top of a mountain similar to Machu Picchu. And it has all of these strange grooves and things, bases for towers. There's very little that's there today except that's not solid rock and carved. It's as if there was structures here, walls and things like that, but they've all been washed away, like in some giant cataclysmic tidal wave or something like that, that washed over Bolivia and wiped all this stuff out. So you can see these things, strange grooves and stuff. Eric von Däniken, in one of his earlier books, theorized that this was maybe some kind of rocket launching place, you know, for the extraterrestrials. We'll see. This was a Swiss Bolivian guy who lives nearby, and we stayed with him. And he had an auto parts store in the main town called Santa Cruz. And he was digging a well, he said, and when he got down to about 100 feet in this well, he started coming up with these sandstone blocks that were all grooved, kind of like gutters or pipes for some kind of plumbing or something like that in his well. So what seemed to be going on there was, yeah, there was some city or something buried underneath him and underneath his house. And he happened to be digging a well, so he happened to dig part of it up. So nearby, is the Altiplano. And the Altiplano is this high area. Most of it's in Bolivia, some of it's in Peru. And there in the northern end of the Altiplano is what's called Lake Titicaca. And on the southern part of Lake Titicaca, about 5 miles or so from what is today the shore, is Tiwanaku and Pumapunku. At Tiwanaku and Pumapunku, and there was a pyramid there, and the pyramid had a lake at the top. And in fact, Tiwanaku and Pumapunku were apparently some kind of a canal city. There are underwater ruins in Lake Titicaca. Lake Titicaca, too, has a lot of UFO activity. We'll talk about that in a minute. Some people believe there's some kind of underwater space base or something there. UFOs are seen coming out of the lake. It's a very popular story when you're at Lake Titicaca. And most people who live around there do say that, yeah, Lake Titicaca, you know, it's this hotbed of UFO activity. There are underwater ruins in Lake Titicaca. We know there are some. And I discuss this more in my book. One of the other strange things about Lake Titicaca is that there are seahorses in Lake Titicaca. And that's a very strange thing, right? And biologists can't really figure that out. Seahorses are, of course, oceanic animals living in the Pacific Ocean, usually, and in warm water. One area where a lot of seahorses can be found is more like around Indonesia and Malaysia and places like that. But there are seahorses in Lake Titicaca, and what that would indicate was that somehow, at some point, which is totally bizarre, Lake Titicaca was at sea level and connected to the ocean. But today, it's like at 12,000 feet in the Andes. So certain people, and like you, I've always been fascinated, and I've studied carefully stories of Atlantis and Lemuria, Mu, all those kind of things. And one of the guys who wrote a lot about Mu was Colonel James Churchward, who wrote The Lost Continent of Mu. This is one of his illustrations. He believed, like Le Plongeon, and Poznański may well have believed this too, the Polish archaeologists who lived at Tiwanaku for like 50 years, they thought that somehow in the ancient times the South America was as a tectonic plate was down, and that there was the Amazon itself was a sea, as we're seeing here, and that there was like some kind of ancient Panama Canal or something that was crossing from the Pacific to the Amazon Sea, and that it was all, you know, kind of sea level. So this is how guys like James Church were theorizing what was going on at Tiwanaku and in Lake Titicaca. You'll see here the monolithic doors. This is the most famous thing at Tiwanaku. They call it the Gate of the Sun. It's cut out of solid granite, and you can see again the articulation. It's been split in some earthquake. And in fact, it's not where it's been erected at Tiwanaku. It's not where it really was, and it's kind of a mystery even just exactly who put this gate where it is. It's almost as if somebody in ancient times moved it, Tiwanaku already being in ruins, and then placed it where it is. You've got the strange statues. They're wearing turbans. Some of these guys are fishmen with their pants and things are like fish scales. So you have also then the birdmen. So you have at Tiwanaku this juxtaposition of birdmen and the fishmen. One of the other things at Tiwanaku too is that there is this tunnel system and what are hydraulics. And in fact, they wouldn't even at one point allow you to take pictures of this, but now they will. But if you see down here, this little opening there at the bottom, and what this is like channels for water. And even though mainstream archaeologists don't really go for this, but apparently what was going on at Tiwanaku was they had diverted what's called the Tiwanaku River, and water was washing into this river, and there was channels everywhere. And they forced water up into this pyramid to this lake, and that would require what's called a ram pump, forcing water uphill. And then they would use that water reservoir to come down. It was apparently washing ores. And what I maintain is that Tiwanaku and Pumapunku were really a part of a huge mining and metal complex where they were washing ores. Then they were refining them. You were going to have forges and things like that. You're creating molten metals. And we'll get more into that in a minute. Also here at Tiwanaku, and Graham briefly talked about this, is the famous Kon-Tiki statue there that Thor Heyerdahl, the famous Norwegian archaeologist who was inspiration to many of us, including me. And I met him in Peru many years ago, which was great. And he's a bearded god with a big, thick mustache and beard. Again, this is a mystery. American Indians don't have facial hair. They don't have to shave. They can't grow really beards and mustaches. So whenever you see that, this is always something else. But he's doing something also that's interesting. His hands are in what they call the tiki position, which is one hand over your heart and one hand over your stomach. This is the famous tiki position. If you go to Tahiti and New Zealand and stuff today, you buy pendants out of seashell or jade or something, greenstone. And he's doing always exactly the same thing, with one hand over his heart, one hand over his stomach, the tiki position. And this guy's called Kon-Tiki. So already you have this connection now of that Pacific connection with Tiwanaku and Pumapunku, Easter Islands, Kon-Tiki, Tahiti, and all these guys. And that's exactly what Thor Heyerdahl was saying too. Here we go, the Akapana Pyramid, which is partly destroyed today. And you'd had this Andean cross type reservoir at the top. So it held water, and then they used that water to wash throughout Tiwanaku. So now you can see where Tiwanaku and stuff is of La Paz. This is Lake Titicaca. This is the Altiplano. Tiwanaku is kind of sitting here at this lower area right over here. Let's see, right over in that area, just in the southern part. Now what happened there too is that, and what some people are theorizing was there was some giant cataclysm in the Andes, and the Andes have already risen up, and they're 12,000 feet, just would probably happen millions of years ago. Certainly mainstream archaeologists and geologists would say that. But that some kind of cataclysm occurred in the past that really caused a tidal wave on the Altiplano from all of the water in Lake Titicaca. This is a satellite photo of Lake Titicaca. And it's this area here. Lake Titicaca is in what's called a greater lake and a lesser lake down here. And there's only a narrow isthmus that connects the two greater lake and the smaller lake. The smaller lake down here at the bottom is actually fairly shallow. The really deep parts of Lake Titicaca, and it is a very deep lake, are more of the very northern part of the lake. It's in this southern part of the lake, here we go, and particularly in this part over here where it said that there is a sunken city. And it's also said that that is an area where these UFOs are coming out of. So this is it, this smaller lake. And Tiwanaku is down here towards, just about 5 miles from the shores. And so this area here is known as this UFO area. It supposedly has a sunken city in it. So it's, in a way, according to legend, there's two things there. One is like UFO base, in a sense, that with UFOs, flying saucers and things coming out of the water, going down there. But then also just really ancient ruins, like Tiwanaku, that are there. It's all pretty mysterious. With the reed boats are there too. The same reeds are on Easter Island. Reed boats are these boats that can't really be sunk. A guy that I recently ran into in La Paz, he's an artist, his name is Ramiro Gonzalez, and he wrote a book in Spanish called Tiwanaku, a Garden of the Andes, and it's in Spanish. And his whole concept, he's an artist, so he drew some really nice paintings. His whole concept was that Tiwanaku and Lake Titicaca and stuff, that it was the Garden of Eden. And this is the area where potatoes originated, and it's possible that corn originated there. Lots of vegetables, chirimoyas and things like that, all come from around this area. What Ramiro Gonzalez believed was that Tiwanaku was part of this vast canal system like this. This is what his concepts of Tiwanaku coming out. Lots of water. The shores of the lake came closer to the city. They diverted, like Venice today or Amsterdam or something. They created all kinds of artificial canals and things like that. And he thought that it was all done before this pole shift. He drew these cool maps and stuff of like South America flipped around and how the ocean was. And basically, according to him, or his theories, was that South America was just like this thin, mountain archipelago, something like, say, New Zealand or something today, just sort of rising up out of the ocean. Certainly, Tiwanaku and Pumapunku were some kind of canal city. Water was everywhere. Pumapunku, which is what we're looking at here, giant slabs of sandstone and granite, also weighing 100, 200 tons, scattered around like some kids' building blocks, just destroyed in some cataclysm. And we're going to see here also these keystone cuts. And these keystone cuts, they're all over the world, as we're going to see in a minute. And we saw them also at these blocks at Ollantaytambo. So the mainstream archaeologists conveniently just ignore all this, that keystone cuts are really from Tiwanaku, that's known to be pre-Inca. But yet when they find them in so-called Inca construction, they say, oh no, this was just done 150 years before the Spanish came. So once again, you've got the giant blocks, and you wouldn't think they're going anywhere, and in fact they've been wiped out and destroyed. Huge things, here we are. We'll look at that. Lots of careful articulation in these stones, cut very perfectly, and to articulate all these little angles and things like that. Once again, this is something that can only really be done with power tools. You can't do this with bashing things out with a rock. You can't do it with copper chisels. You're going to need very, very hard tools and cutting blades and saws and things like that. So one of the things too that we're going to see, all right, some of the keystone cuts there are huge. I mean, so they're going to have to pour into these keystone cuts molten metals, some kind of bronze probably. And so more of the keystone cuts cut into the massive things. Here we are. This is part of the Ancient Aliens shoot 1 year ago there at Pumapunku. These are the famous H blocks that are similarly cut. Again, another keystone cut, this one for a huge, huge clamp, trying to fit these gigantic blocks together. More keystone cuts. Here's Christopher Dunn, where we went with him a couple of times to Tiwanaku and Pumapunku. And he's a machinist who's originally from England and lives in Illinois now. And he's a guy who carries around careful little gauges and measurements and stuff like that. And I always trust him on his findings and things. And so he's looking at these things. Little tiny drill holes, little cuts and things like that in these stones. Evidence that power tools are being used here. Things that can't be done by primitive stone workings. And that would be, yeah, these little cuts here. And it's hard to see, but they're actually little drill holes and things like that there. So this is the kind of thing that you're looking for. Something where a saw is being used, and it has to be some kind of a power tool. All over Pumapunku, it's buried. It's like some tidal wave, just destroyed the whole area, buried it under tons of muck and muck, more keystone cuts. This is what you see there, where blocks of stone are just lying on some mud pillar or something. And it's as if the whole building was completely destroyed, wiped out in a tidal wave, and buried in mud and muck. And then finally, starting around 1910 or so, archaeologists began to excavate it. Incredibly, too, as Graham was talking about some of the dating and how the dating is just so incorrect, this is one of the giant statues that came out of Tiwanaku, and they're huge. They were also just buried in mud and muck. And this is a strange thing, too. This is by the Akapana Pyramid, and we noticed this, and we were with Chris one time, and it's part of a giant door. And this part right here, what we noticed was, bizarrely, that there had been a big chip had been taken out of this block, but then somebody, and obviously in ancient times, had patched it with some kind of weird concrete. And so now you have, again, the liquid stone kind of thing, and it was colored and everything, and it was really hard. And we found a couple of other places for it here too, where right in here, where holes in the rock, or places where it had cracked or been chipped, the ancients, whoever they were, had taken their special concrete putty and patched it up, and it's some kind of super hard, putty that's different from our modern concrete. Here's another oddball block that we looked at with Christopher Dunn, which is also at Tiwanaku. And the way it's been cut, and this is something that would have to take like a lathe to make this curve coming down. And then these inside angles here, this is all perfectly flat. To make something like this really requires really sophisticated grinding and machining tools to make this with diamond cutting heads and routers and stuff like that. All over Pumapunku and Tiwanaku are these monolithic doors, like the Gate of the Sun. They're cut out of solid pieces of granite. You can see them, and even they have drill holes underneath. This is also a monolithic door. Many of them, they're all fallen. Two of them they have re-erected at Tiwanaku, so you can see them. Most of them are cracked. Where monolithic doors are also found is in the Xerxes Palace in Persepolis, today in Iran. And these are monolithic doors here. They're carved out of a single piece of granite. And they have the same kind of articulation. that you see at the monolithic doors at Tiwanaku and Pumapunku. So, and in fact, they're so amazingly similar that you would have to draw some connection here. They even have these jambs coming in and the articulation going inside it. All of that is indicative of using sophisticated power tools to make these things. And so not just cutting these things and articulating them, we're talking 20-ton, 50-ton blocks of granite. Here is one of the bronze clamps or clamps in the museum. So this is how they fitted them together. They only find a few of these because ancient tribes and people coming through the destroyed ruins of Pumapunku and Tiwanaku, whenever they would see some keystone, metal like that, I mean, they would grab it and turn it into a spearhead or a knife or something like that. These keystone cuts are in Egypt. They're at Karnak Temple in Luxor. So it's the same kind of a thing with these. These are hourglass keystone cuts. You always have to have a keystone cut's always on two blocks. So you can fit them together and you pour things in. So the Egyptians were using keystone cuts too. This is a really unusual way of fitting megalithic blocks together. I mean, the idea that people around the world would just do this separately seems totally impossible. This is at Edfu in Egypt, and these are keystone cuts too. Only they're on a wall. And again, like the wall I was showing at Ollantay Tambo, this wall at Edfu, this wasn't made by the original builders. These keystone cuts aren't supposed to be there. This is a wall, and in fact, I mean, keystone cuts have to be on a vertical blocks because molten metal's poured into them. So like this block over here, I mean, you can see this is really a reconstructed wall by the Egyptians themselves from older material, which had keystone cuts in it. And they just took the blocks, reassembled them into some other different wall, and that's why, what we're seeing today. So here we go, so Edfu. So these are the blocks in Egypt. All right, we're going to go now to an unusual site that you may never have heard of before, and it's a place called My Son, and it's in Vietnam. My Son, and in Vietnam, you're going to also see keystone cuts. Here we go, just like the ones at Tiwanaku. And this is My Son. These are also keystone cuts at My Son. My Son is a megalithic city. It's in central Vietnam, near Da Nang, right near where all the fighting was during the Vietnam War, actually, because it's right there. It was actually in South Vietnam, but it was right near the border of South and North Vietnam. And in fact, the people who are responsible for My Son and its megalithic blocks, its keystone cuts and things like that, were a people known as the Kham. The Kham, or the Kham. And in fact, in ancient times, the Kham, this is a picture of what My Son looks like. My Son is a city, according to mainstream archaeologists, that supposedly goes back to around 200 BC, 200 to 500 BC. Again, the dating is often wrong. I think a lot of these places look much older than they originally say. But the Kham also had this island here, and in Vietnam they pronounce Kham with a C-H-A-M. It could be written K-A-M or K-H-A-M. Kham in ancient Egyptian language meant Egypt. And in fact, even today, in Arabic, Egypt is called Kamet. That's what some Egyptians today would call Egypt. They don't call it Egypt, they say Kamet, or Kham. So the ancient word for Egypt was Kham, but here are these people in Southeast Asia, and they're called the Kham. They're too. And their main headquarters was this island that's off of the central part. My Son was actually inland over here up a river. Some of the iconography at My Son, like Angkor Wat, was the people there, the Kham, were originally Hindus, kind of Egyptian Hindus in a sense, but then later they became Buddhists, like at Angkor Wat, and as much of Southeast Asia converted to Buddhism around 200 BC or something like that. Many of the guys at Kham, the statues, they also look like they're Africans. And we'll see that. There's a real similarity to the Olmecs. This is one of the statues at Mison. There's Shiva, third eye in the forehead, all that stuff. I mean, these guys, they believed, yes, reincarnation, karma, Ramayana and stuff like that. This is also a statue from Mison. Looks very Mayan, in fact. So the statue's there. Here's another bearded guy with a mustache. He's a Kham guy too. Now what the Kham were doing then, they were then leaving the Vietnam and Southeast Asia. And the Kham were all over Southeast Asia and Indonesia. They would go out into the Pacific. They were going to, they would go out to New Guinea. It was probably the Kham who settled Tonga and then Tahiti and Marquesas and stuff like that. And then they made it across the Pacific, actually. This is Angkor Wat. Angkor Wat started earlier as Hindu temples, then they were recarved into Buddhist heads and things like that. Angkor Wat is easily many thousands of years old, I think. Although mainstream archaeologists give Angkor Wat just a date of about 500 years ago. But there are also the keystone cuts there, and the clamps. Japanese archaeologists have also discovered and found this there. There are also monolithic doors at Angkor Wat too. Just very similar to what we're finding at Tiwanaku and Pumapunku and in Persepolis. Now the Kham also went into this area too. This is the island of Sulawesi, which is a remote and still little explored island in Indonesia. And in the middle of this island, in high valleys, is a place called the Bada Valley. Today, it can be reached only with a four-wheel drive up this muddy road that was only built just about 10 years ago. And it's quite the trip. It's a super remote place in this jungle mountain valley. And what's there are all of these megalithic statues. And they're also apparently made with power tools. And they're huge. And they're set into these fields. The people have no idea who made them. They're thought to be from about 6,000 years old. This is what archaeologists suspect. They don't really know. This is what it's like. These are some of the giant statues. And it's bizarre. But the statues are really, really well made. And they're 20, 30, 40-ton granite blocks. They're erected. They're not sure where they would have even gotten the granite. They're not sitting right there. And they, too, have their hands kind of coming down. And Graham was showing that, too. Like the Easter Island statues, their hands are coming down towards their waist and holding it there. And I thought it was really interesting, too, what Graham was showing of the Göbekli Tepe guys, too, with their hands coming down. So this is what they look like. I mean, really finely cut, these things. And even after thousands of years, these blocks are still very sharp, very well defined. What's also in Bada Valley are these giant stone jars and vessels. And they're cut out of solid granite. They've been hollowed out. It also looks like they're machined. And there's a place in Laos like this too, called the Plain of Jars, where these granite vessels are there. They don't know, again, who made these, why, what they're for. They don't know how they made them because they're very highly polished, and the edges, many of them are broken. So even what the purpose of these was, as is the ones in Laos, they don't know. All right, back to keystone cuts. You have these things. This is from an old National Geographic, actually from the 40s, showing how keystone cuts were used in Greece. So once again, you have this unusual way of fitting megalithic blocks together, but it's a technique found all over the world. So back to Tiwanaku in South America, these are the H blocks. This recent episode of Ancient Aliens talks about this. There's evidence that they are like Lego blocks or something, and they're mass-produced in some factory. It's almost like some airship came down with a factory on it, machines, giant saws, and then they started. You need material. You've got to get the granite blocks and stuff, and then they just started cutting these things into these highly complex H blocks, spewing them out, and then the guys out there start fitting them together perfectly, creating, again, this is another idea of what Pumapunku looked like. Some strange building with all this articulation. I mean, it's being done by somebody who, even today, in Bolivia. There is not a construction company in Bolivia that could make a building like this. They just wouldn't even try to do it. It would be just too much effort. Another concept of what Pumu Punku might have looked like. So complicated. Here we go in the at the Museum of Pumu Punku. They're showing how, yeah, here are these carefully articulated blocks, and now they're pouring the molten metal to make the keystone clamps there. But of course, the guys, I mean, these are primitive people, you know, so they're sort of wearing some, you know, sandals and got like a kind of little tunic on them, you know. They'll later go home, their little hut, and, you know, eat some boiled potatoes or something. But yet, you know, these guys are making buildings that we couldn't even make them today. So here we go, looking at some of the articulation of these H blocks. I mean, you just, for some normal person to, or some primitive stonemason to even want to make a block like this, you can't really fathom. I mean, what is the purpose? Why, and that's part of the problem with all megalithic things, is why are people trying to do things that seem so difficult to us? And part of the answer is that it just can't have been that difficult for them. You know, to levitate giant blocks, to cut them and move them and things like that, it had to be easier. And that's where the high technology comes in, levitation, floating stones, cutting them with lasers and super power tools and stuff. This is a pyramid that's near to Tiwanaku, and out of this thing came an unusual artifact. Right now, the people in this village they're excavating this pyramid, and it's not a recognized pyramid yet by mainstream archaeologists, because the people in that village are basically looting it, and they don't want Bolivian archaeologists anywhere near this thing. And Bolivia is a country that's pretty disorganized, so you can kind of get away with a lot of stuff there. But what they found, what came out of this pyramid at some point, again by these looters, is a thing called the Potiki monolith. And on it, and there's another artifact too that you'll see in a minute called the Fuente Magna Bowl. On the monolith is Sumerian writing is on it. And it's a type of Sumerian hieroglyphs, and it has been deciphered. And now what has also been found, and this is all just in the last 5 years or so, is a thing called the Fuente Magna Bowl. And this is it. And it's today in what's called the Precious Metals Museum in La Paz. And that's a new museum. It's only been there about 5 years. And this bowl is in that museum. Now, this bowl is a bomb for modern archaeology, because what it is in it, it has cuneiform, Sumerian cuneiform written into it, plus Sumerian hieroglyphs. The Sumerians had a number of different scripts, a hieroglyphic script, and then a cuneiform script. So here we go. It actually has cuneiform, and it has this Sumerian hieroglyphic script in it. Here's the hieroglyphic script that we're looking at. Apparently both the Potiki monolith, which you can't see, I have seen it because of Ancient Aliens. They brought it out, and it's kept in a vault in the museum. Normally you can't see it. If you go to the museum, you can see the Fuente Magna Bowl. And here's the cuneiform writing on it. Both of them have, in Sumerian, as they've been deciphered it, they're oracles, libations, good luck stuff. A lot of Sumerian and Hittite writing and stuff. There's a lot of blessings and consulting oracles and stuff, and that's apparently what these things were. But what is so important about this is that this is the guy who discovered the Fuente Magna Bowl. In fact, he had it in his house, and then what they did was they traded him some land and like a new little house for the Fuente Magna Bowl, and he was happy. But what's really important here is that the Fuente Magna Bowl is in a national museum in La Paz. I mean, it's an official national museum. That the Bolivian government would put that bowl in the Precious Metals Museum for everyone to see, this destroys all the explanations of Tiwanaku and the history of South America right there. Just that bowl in itself. And in fact, mainstream archaeologists, it just can't be there. But it is. And if they could, they would say, get that bowl out of that museum. Put it somewhere, put it back in the ground in that pyramid. And so what can mainstream archaeologists do about it? All they can actually do is ignore it. And they do. So here we go. That was some of the Sumerian hieroglyphic stuff like that. This is what these guys look like. This is one of the guys at the Tiwanaku Museum. He's wearing a turban. He does look very much like a sort of Andean Aymara guy. Here's some other guys from the Tiwanaku Museum. The bottom guy looks very Oriental, like a Chinese guy. The guy on top with big mustache and beard, again, he's like some Semite or Phoenician or Roman or Jewish guy or whatever, Irish, or who knows. Now, one of the things that you get there too are the cone heads. So you've got this dolichocephalus, the cranial deformation. Get this, you can't see, this is in the museum there at Tiwanaku, but they've covered this up. You can't see this anymore. And I found that just in the last couple of years, displays of the people with the deformed long heads and stuff like that, they've removed them. And we're going to see some more right now. Some of the most exciting and interesting conehead skulls and stuff actually come from the Ica, Paracas area, which around here, Pisco. This is the desert area. Nazca's farther down south. Lima's up north. This is a very dry desert. Lots of skulls and mummies have been found there. I mean, literally thousands. It's so incredibly dry that skeletal material, mummies and things like that are very well preserved. But if you go to some of the museums there, particularly the museum at Ica, you're going to see some pretty weird looking guys with really extended craniums. I mean, sometimes twice the size of our cranium. I mean, these guys are coneheads, okay? And they're totally real. This is absolutely real. A lot of them come from a pyramid near Paracas called Chongos. This guy's from the Chongos pyramid. This is what the Chongos pyramid looks like. It's still not really excavated. There's a necropolis there. They're constantly digging up around there. And the people they find who live around this pyramid typically have these elongated cranium. Now, there's different explanations for this, and this is another thing that went on all over the world. And the idea too is that when you're still just a tiny infant, the plates in your head haven't fused yet, and it's possible to manipulate the skull. And you can widen it, you can make pumpkin heads, you can make cone heads, you can do things. But you have these plates in your head, and then eventually they're going to fuse at some point as you get older. But this guy right here, and Brian Forster was able to find this head in Paracas, and it just doesn't have the normal plates of a human head. And that's an oddball thing. So the idea that some of these guys say are extraterrestrials, and that their anatomical makeup and of their skull and even the plates in their head and stuff like that is different than humans. Can be seen in some of these skulls, particularly this one. So, I mean, we know that people, it's just absolutely a fact that people had these elongated, strange heads, and it was all over the world, actually. Something else that's associated with this cranial deformation stuff is what's called tree panning. And tree panning is where you take a skull and you cut a hole in the skull. And this skull here is tree panned. There's different ways to do it. Some are cored in with like a drill. Other tree panning is done with a saw. And this guy actually had a gold plate put into his head. And he's today in the Gold Museum in Lima. Some of the guys too, and the skulls and things you find in South America have red hair. And that was something too that we did with Ancient Aliens, where these red-haired giants in Nevada also had long red hair. And that's something of a mystery all around the world of red-haired people, and there's probably a few redheads here in the audience today, but yeah, we're going to miss you guys when you're all gone. The Easter Island statues too. They were like redheads too. They're also apparently coneheads. Graham made that interesting remark too of their big chins and that of being beards. But they're basically depicting cone heads there too. They have elongated heads at Easter Island. And with the top knot, they apparently had red hair too. And the way Sadhus in India will tie their hair, big long hair, and they tie it in a big knot up on top of their head. And that's essentially what the Easter Island statues are doing too. At Paracas, as well as what they call the candlestick of the Andes. This is like cut there into this desert. And it seems to be pointing towards Tiwanaku or inland, something like that. Just south is Nazca, with all the lines etched into the ground and figures and things like that. It's all pretty strange. And they can really only be seen by the air. And you would think that, that people are, you know, it's for the sky gods or some kind of airport. And when you see it too, it is like some airport with all these trapezoids, these lines. Some of them go for 100 miles up towards Tiwanaku and stuff like that. Archaeologists are baffled by what it's all about and why they would build these things. Some of it is that it was some big astrological chart or something like that. The Olmecs, too, in Mexico, they also had cranial deformation. Many of them were cone heads. This is what they often look like. This is also a display that was at Comacalco in Mexico, and I was just recently there, and they've removed this display. And I was just a few weeks ago, I was there, and I was looking for exactly these guys right there that I had taken a photo of 10 years ago, and they've removed it from the museum. And in fact, they had a small display about cranial deformation, but then the skull they had there was barely elongated. I mean, it didn't look like these guys at all. I mean, they were really downplaying the whole cranial deformation thing. These skulls here are at the museum in Merida in the Yucatan in Mexico. And this guy's a pumpkin head. So that his face is like smashed in and widened. And he's looking like a weird guy. But this is kind of what they did. He's trepan too. This is one of the ways that you can manipulate a skull. And as with the infant, you do this cradling. You smash it, you force the skull to grow in certain ways, what they're doing here. So this is one way you can do it. And I mean, it's really kind of a mystery. We know for a fact that at least, you know, some people were doing this. Were they trying to imitate extraterrestrials or something like that? Did they want to look like these other people? I mean, that's part of the question. We're going to see some more. It was only in 1940 that archaeologists actually recognized that the Olmecs existed, and that there was suddenly this other people who were pre-Mayan. They started finding these what they call colossal heads. They weigh about 20 tons. Some of them are in Guatemala. Most of them are buried. These are Olmec statues too. They're carved out of basalt in the Pacific side of Guatemala, which is not an area that tourists go. There's all these sugarcane fields, and they use bulldozers to make these fields, and they suddenly come up with stuff like that, just giant statues and heads and stuff like that, just buried in the ground. Here's an Olmec head too, finely carved into basalt. Again, they would have had to use power tools to do this. And many of them look very African, which is also what the Kham look like in Vietnam. Many of those statues too, the guys look Africans. And of course, Egypt is in Africa and the Kham. So these are some of the statues. This is what it was like with the early Mexican archaeologists in the 40s, just finding these giant heads in the jungle. A lot of this area is very much a swamp area of Mexico, and it's where really the oil rigs and a lot of the oil exploration is today. At La Venta, there was also a very sophisticated system for sewage and water and stuff like that. All megalithic. The whole area of the Olmecs really is, and here's Comacalco and La Venta, this is sort of the core area, but they're down here. They're in the Guatemala side. They were across Monte Alban. And that was the thing, is that the Olmecs were both on the Pacific and the Atlantic side. And this is what's called the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, which is this narrowest area of Mexico, where you could, if you were to land on the Atlantic or Pacific coast, you could just in a few days, in a way, walk between the two oceans. And in fact, before they built the Panama Canal, they had thought about building a Panama-type canal here. And there were 3 sites to try to link the Pacific and the Atlantic. Panama, of course, being one. Another was in Nicaragua, and the other was this site here in Mexico, the Tehuantepec. This guy is an Olmec too, and he looks very Egyptian. He's got a false beard, which was a famous thing that the Egyptians did, but we don't think of other people. This guy's an Olmec. He's holding one of the rubber balls. Here's one of the colossal Olmec heads, and this one is really a curious one because when you look at these pock marks that are in the head, it's like somebody tried to deface this statue with a power tool. I mean, they went, and archaeologists can't figure this one out. And it was obviously done in ancient times. This thing was destroyed and buried, but at some time, you know, even the maker himself decided, oh, you know, I don't like this. And he just started dishing stuff out with his, whatever he was using. It had to be some kind of power thing to do that. As well as some of the other statues, if you look on the back side of them, the ones from Levanta, they also have all these curious drill marks and stuff in them. Like somebody, again, for no real reason, just took their power tool and started like drilling into it, you know, something to do, you know, during his break or something. This was also a Comacalco, which they removed. This was some of the different statues and faces, and they look like they're from all over the world. Some of them look Chinese, others look like they're from Africa, others look like they're aliens from some other planet. All kinds, you know, just a strange bunch of guys. And there are these cone heads. This was a famous, this is what they call the famous Levanta, they call it Offering 13, of jade figurines, or what are called jade celts. They're all these, depicting these conehead guys with these weird eyes and stuff like that. And in 1998, they brought, there's some writing on these jade celts, which are these things. They're kind of like an adze, they call them celts. And there's writings and hieroglyphs on it. They brought, from Beijing, they brought the world's expert, Chinese expert on Shang Chinese early writing. This is the proto-writing of China. And when he looked at the writing on these celts, he said, yeah, that's Shang Chinese writing, and from the early writing. And this was published, you know, as stories in Mexico City. It was in U.S. News and World Report. But once again, mainstream just conveniently just ignores all this stuff. I mean, if it can be ignored, they ignore it. And they do so often, like the Fuente Magna Bowl at the Precious Metals Museum in La Paz. All right, this is one of Akhenaten's daughters, Meritaten, and she's a conehead too. So the Egyptians were doing this. This was something they were doing all over the world. Akhenaten, Nefertiti, Meritaten, Meketaten, Tutankhamun, he was a conehead. This is a statue of him that was in his tomb. This is what he looked like. This is another statue of, this is one of his own statues of him from his tomb. So whenever you see all these things about Tutankhamun, and they x-ray him, and they talk about the mystery of his death, was he murdered? They x-ray his mummy. They never mention that he's a conehead. You'd think that'd be kind of interesting. No, they don't want to talk about that. So some of the other coneheads are the Anunnaki from Sumeria. This is what some of them look like from what they call the Ubaid culture. Mainstream archaeologists date them to about 3000 BC. That's when these guys were. And so, by the way, that would be about the date of the Fuente Magna Bowl, or the Potiquia monolith in Tiwanaku, is about 3000 BC. So that's what these guys look like. They're these figurines that come out of Sumeria. We don't really have skeletal material of these guys. They have what they call the coffee bean eyes. They have the cone heads. Sometimes they're called the Watchers or the Nephilim. Are they extraterrestrials? Are they humans? Are they half extraterrestrial, half human, hybrids? These are all the questions that people want to know. The Chinese did this too. Here's one of the Taoist mortal guys. He's a conehead, if I ever saw one. And so, yeah, you've got these guys with this extremely extended cranium. I mean, what is this all about? Why are they doing that? Here you have the pumpkin head guys and the M heads with these curious kind of things. This is a weird one. The Olmecs did this too. And some of the statues of the Olmecs have this, skulls like this. And that's a weird one. Archaeologists, I mean, they don't even want to talk about this stuff. And in fact, when Brian and I, by the way, they did in the United States too. This is like a Chinook Indian from up around Seattle. They did that too. I went to high school in Missoula, Montana, and what's just north of Missoula is Flathead Lake, which is the largest freshwater lake west of the Mississippi. And Flathead Lake is called Flathead Lake because of the Flathead Indians. And why were the Flathead Indians called the Flatheads? Because they had flat heads and they were cone heads, like this lady too. So yeah, I mean, people were actually doing this head binding and cranial deformation right up until the 1960s. By the way, the Kurds in northern Iraq, they were doing this too. And they're still doing this up until the 1960s. And there are still some people today in certain Pacific islands and stuff who still have the extended craniums. So here's a young guy. This is in Africa. There's tribes in Africa that do this too. I mean, this is such an unusual thing to be going and creating, this cranial deformation. Yet it's done all over the world. On remote Pacific islands, in Africa, and, as we know, in South America and stuff. And the idea that people are doing this independently, for some reason, they just, somebody, totally separate from other cultures decided, yeah, let's make some cone heads. Is this what it's like with a little baby and his head is wrapped up and stuff like that? So certainly we can take a normal human like us, and you can turn your kid into a cone head if you wanted. He'll be bullied in school terribly. You won't want to do that. I know I'm running out of time, and James, how am I doing here? I should probably just wind up. I can kind of stop any time.
No, here's what we can do. Can
okay.
you just speak into the microphone?
Yeah, if you want. Yeah, here, right there.
Okay. One thing that we can do is let David continue until 5:30, break for lunch, and then just
why don't I just go on for another 5 minutes or so?
Okay, 5 minutes.
I think that would be good. All right, let's do that. So, just real quickly, I'm just winding up here. I can't go on. I'm talking again tomorrow morning, so there'll be more then. One of the other things that's really unusual is the stone balls around the world. That's another archaeological enigma. These ones are in Costa Rica. Costa Rica is famous for these giant granite balls. They're perfectly round. They know they're man-made. There's no question about it. Making a perfectly round granite ball that weighs 5 tons or something like that is very difficult. And in fact, it's said that that's one of the most difficult things to do without computers and like CAD program is to create a perfectly round ball. And again, mainstream archaeologists are saying, well, yeah, I mean, these guys in the jungles of Costa Rica, they just had, everything, they're just smashing things out with a stone hammer in their hand. And yeah, they're going to make these stone balls. But again, they're like machined and stuff like that. Most of them are found in the southern west little bottom corner of Costa Rica, right down here. Panama's right there. Some are actually found on this island that's just off the coast of Costa Rica, which is weird. And they're just found in the jungles and stuff like that. I mean, archaeologists, again, they can't explain it. They have no idea what these things could possibly be for. I mean, they just don't make sense. I mean, they're just something, what they say now is that, well, these chiefs, they like stone balls. And this is what they say. Well, and then when the chief got buried, they'd bury a stone ball with him, Although some of these stone balls are the size of a Volkswagen or something. I mean, they couldn't bury them with these chiefs. I mean, they're just, grasping for some explanation. It's like, well, we don't know. Here's an interesting thing, too, is that with the stone balls, so what I've started finding out and going to Costa Rica some years ago, I was like, man, this whole stone ball enigma. And then we went to Bosnia, too, and we saw Samir and these stone balls in Bosnia. I'll see those in a minute. A guy sent this to me, and he said, well, I got this pamphlet, from Santa Monica. Well, in 1910 in Santa Monica, they were building a tram from Santa Monica inland. And, electric trams can only go up a certain grade. So they had to kind of level hills and stuff like that so that the tracks were never getting too steep. So they had this old steam engine here that's like digging out this hill. This is Los Angeles, okay? And what did they find? They found all these stone balls there. I mean, how about that? We don't know what happened to these things. The archaeologists at the time said, oh, well, they're dinosaur eggs. Okay, so there's your other explanation for these stone balls. Well, I got dinosaur eggs. So how about that? I mean, they're just like, well, you know, what's this all about? Well, and then I found out that Franz Josef Land in the Russian Arctic, and you know, you've got to go on some special, you know, cruise to get up there. Well, they got stone balls up there on this glacier. And they can't, I mean, they don't know. I mean, they're not, now they're saying, well, this is not man-made. No, I mean, that's a dinosaur egg, you know, I mean, well, they don't know. And some of them apparently are like perfectly round. They don't have a good explanation for these things. And they're like, well, we don't know. So they're like just kind of washed up in some tidal wave after a pole shift or something like that. Yeah. These are the stone balls in Bosnia. And if you make a trip to Visoko and stuff, with Samir, you probably will see these. They're in a ravine. And apparently, as I was really interested in this in Bosnia, that there's a lot of stone balls there. And I was amazed that apparently all over Bosnia are little sites where there are these stone balls. And again, they don't have an explanation for them. Why would people doing all these things? There's a place in Mexico, too, with the stone balls. These are supposedly volcanic bombs. That was their explanation for these things. And that's maybe right. I mean, not all these stone balls are necessarily man-made, but some of them definitely are. The ones in Costa Rica, there's no doubt about it with those ones. Okay, they're in Italy and stuff, too. They're the places with stone balls. These ones are in Italy. These stone balls are in Italy. Some stone balls, like these ones here in Dubrovnik, I mean, they're like cannonballs, I guess. Stone cannonballs that they were using in the Middle Ages. But the really big balls it's simply not cannonballs. We don't think. I mean, it's just the marbles of the gods or something. And then I found out that there was this town in China, Gongxi, China, and it's famous for its stone balls in the town. And you know, again, nobody has a good explanation for that. Here's one of the, again, stone balls. So it's an interesting idea that some of them, perhaps in nature, I mean, I can see that, how some of these stone balls are just made through, you know, volcanic, you know, eruptions and spewing and stuff like that. But others, on Malta, there are also stone balls here. And on Easter Island, there are stone balls too. And in fact, on Easter Island, they say the most important thing is this stone ball right here, which is in a remote area, the northern coast of Easter Island. And they call it the center of the world. On Easter Island, the people will tell you that ball is the most important thing in the entire island. You know, I think this is a good place to end it. And, well, we'll talk again tomorrow. So thanks very much. There had to be some kind of civilization before this. People who are organized, who are stonemasons, who are going to erect giant megalithic monuments. And that's what we're going to see around the world right now. The largest known megaliths in the world, at least those that are above water, are the ones at Baalbek in Lebanon. And this is also a dangerous area to go to. It's difficult to go to many areas today. But here at Baalbek are massive ashlars weighing up to 1,000 tons. The largest one is still partly in the quarry and buried. It weighs over 1,000 tons. And in fact, the whole idea of any modern construction company today moving these stones and stacking them up is out of the question. They can't do it. But modern archaeologists have to explain how giant megalithic blocks, this is the size of a railway car or something, are moved. And here's how they've explained it. There are these small little cuts, like hourglass cuts, are made into the blocks for like a V-shaped wedge to fit in. A cage is built around the block, what you're seeing down over here, and all these ropes and pulleys are put around it, and then they move this block a few inches, and then do it all over again. And you have to ask yourself, with all this kind of thing, is why would anyone even try? The opposite kind of construction of this would be just simple brick construction with layers, and then the bricks can shear, and any kind of brick building particularly is going to be totally demolished in any kind of an earthquake. This now, it looks very similar to walls that you see around Cuzco and stuff like that, but it's actually the Necromanticon which is an underground, also ruins, only discovered in the 1960s in northern Greece. And it's up near the Albanian border. Once again, you see these jigsaw patterns. They had to dig this all out. The blocks are locked into place. And in fact, the ancient Greeks, they associated these ruins, supposedly, with the river Styx and the underworld and Hades and things like that. All right, we're back up into the high Andes around Cusco, where we see more of this kind of gigantic blocks of stone. And in this case, they're mainly limestone, put together in what's called the Sacsayhuaman Fortress, which is above Cusco. Gigantic megalithic fortress. Here it is seen by the air. You see how this whole zigzag patterns, and there were a bunch of towers up at the very top up here. And those towers are destroyed. There's other towers around Lake Titicaca. They're known to be pre-Inca, although mainstream archaeologists are saying that the Incas built all this. These are some of the giant blocks at Sacsayhuaman. According to mainstream archaeologists, the Incas were building this only about 150 years before the Spanish got there, if you can believe that. Moving these gigantic blocks was actually not a sea. It was a dry area with a bunch of lakes. All these Mediterranean islands, like Malta, were not islands at the time. In fact, there were pygmy elephants and pygmy rhinos and stuff living there. But then a giant tidal wave washed into the Mediterranean, wiped all this out, killed all those animals, and then washed them into this cave in Malta called the Dargalam Cave. And that's where they would find all the remains of these pygmy elephants and pygmy rhinos and things like that. Mainstream archaeologists are saying, as Graham had said just a little while earlier, is a place in south-central Turkey, near to the Syrian border, called Göbekli Tepe. And those ruins are now supposedly the oldest ruins in the world, according to mainstream archaeology. And they're going back to around 9,000, 10,000 BC. And that is the time of Atlantis, as Plato and the Egyptians told him. Göbekli Tepe is a megalithic site, and it was buried on this hill. And what's strange about Göbekli Tepe is that, and here's the Göbekli Tepe area, and in fact it's right near where a lot of the fighting is right today, is that the mainstream archaeologists who are actually from a German university, and they are Catholics, and they're saying that, Göbekli Tepe was built before civilization, that there wasn't civilization, there weren't cities, there weren't stonemasons, but yet, they just put this thing together. And of course that doesn't make any sense. Try and do this. Why are people trying to do things so incredibly different? This is what the Mediterranean would look like without the water. We were talking about Malta and stuff. The whole Middle East and everything would have changed, much like Graham was saying earlier. When you talk also about pre-Egyptian ruins in Egypt, you have this place which is known as the Osirion in Abydos. The Osirion is actually below the surface of the ground. Another Egyptian temple is built there because of these other ancient ruins. And there at the Osirion, it's down in the swamp. The Egyptian government spent years, decades, trying to pump out the Osirion. And what I wanted to also make you notice is some of these little knobs and stuff here, and also the way the oddball little angles that you're seeing on some of the blocks, the way they're notched and fitted together. And we're going to be seeing a lot of this all over the world. So we'll start moving around. This is a famous part of a wall in Cusco. The whole idea of these granite megalithic blocks being fitted together in a jigsaw pattern and locked in without any kind of mortar. This is the famous stone of 12 angles in Cusco. Those who've been to Cusco have seen it, where you're going to have the blocks all locked in. And part of the idea of this is that what happens is when a big shockwave of an earthquake hits these walls, like these in Cusco, they move with the shockwave, and the whole wall is able to move in the stones, but they're locked in together because of this jigsaw patterns. So once the shock wave of the earthquake has passed through, they fall back into place. And start looking at megaliths and all kinds of things. And I'll be talking, just like Graham and Samir, I'll be talking a lot about mainstream archaeology and versus what we're seeing and what they say and what some of the evidence is. So Graham was showing this too. Mainstream archaeologists for a long time were saying that the oldest ruins in the world, although a lot of people didn't know this, were in Malta. And some of the ruins of Malta and Gozo, even by mainstream archaeologists, went back to 5,000 BC, 6, even 7,000 BC. There was a story on Gozo that I was told that a German university had done excavations there at the Gigantija ruins, which are these right here. And there's, by the way, all these cart tracks and stuff in Malta. But they found like 30 headless skeletons, and when they tried to carbon date them, they could find no carbon-14 in them. And that meant that they were over 30,000 years old. Whoa. And when a university, makes a discovery like that, they can't believe it, so they don't publish it. And, one of the things at Malta, too, that Malta's evidence that the Mediterranean, back before the last ice age,